So, hey Vic, today we're going to be talking about the categorization of board games and how this impacts game discovery and the game community. The take that I have, presented here is that in general, board games are poorly classified, and this hurts the outreach of the hobby itself.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree. Even just myself as a more experienced board gamer, I find it difficult to browse through different games and find games. So the main kind of catalog I use is Board Game Geek, as I'm sure a lot of people do.
Yep.
And even there, they have a categorization system that's very broad, I would say. And I think in general, the ways that games are classified are very broad and not very informative.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the ones on Board Game Geek is just strategic board games, which, I would argue every board game that isn't a pure luck based game, like pure luck based game, has strategy. So that's already a very weird and kind of dumb category, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think the other ones are like thematic, which also
like every game has some theme, right?
Yeah, it's hard to know where that line is between a game that isn't thematic or isn't categorized as strategic and one that is.
Yeah, I agree. I think these are very broad and therefore harmful terms. But I guess I think there is a bit of a history to how board games have been classified in the past.
Right.
To me, this all really starts with the very, let's say the beginning of the board game hobby as it became more popular, this Settlers of Catan era.
Right.
Where back then, the only games that existed, the only games that were really popular were either Hasbro, Monopoly, Guess Who style games, Trouble, whatever. And then very recent new European Settlers of Catan, Carcassonne. There are probably some other really early pioneers that came out at that time. And this has led to what I consider to be two very harmful terms today. Euro, to indicate Settlers of Catan and more strategic, refined, well-thought-out games. And Ameritrash, which is already an extremely derogatory, views all those games very negatively type term.
Right. Well, I think people are trying to say Ameritrash now or something, just to be a little kinder to it.
What does that even mean? Ameritrash? I've never heard that.
I think it's the same thing, but just instead of trash, they use thrash just to, not be so rude, I guess. I don't know.
Sounds slightly less harsh.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, and that was a 2005, maybe 2000 era snapshot.
Yeah, I think even earlier than that. I want to say Catan was 95. I don't know when it came over, but
yeah,
I want to say it was pre-2000s.
Yep. Yeah, in that zone.
Yeah.
And one thing I particularly dislike is that these terms are still used, Ameritrash apparently now, in 2020.
Okay.
And I would argue they've totally lost their meaning.
Yeah, I would agree, especially the Euro. I honestly don't hear a lot of people say Ameritrash or Ameritrash games anymore.
That's fair.
It's mostly the Euros, and I think it's used, I don't know, it's kind of used in a very strange way now.
Yes.
And I agree, it definitely has lost its meaning. And I think even between us, we have but different definitions of what we classify as Euros and what.
Yep. Yeah, we've had some off-camera discussions about this game is a Euro, and hard disagreements between the two of us as soon as we hear this.
Yeah. So do you want to?
Yeah. Do you think it's worth going into, let's say, a bit of the nuance of this?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it. Do you want to give your definition of what you think a Euro is?
Sure. I will. Sure. Okay. Yes. Contrary to what the name might suggest, Euro absolutely does not mean a game designed by a European. Let's just put that down like first.
It kind of does.
There are some like, let's say, trailblazers in the Euro space who have designed very strategic, well thought out, very planning heavy games. Two people that I think of immediately would be Uwe Rosenberg. I don't know how to really
I think
pronounce
it's Uwe. I don't know.
Uwe Rosenberg.
Yeah.
And Stefan Feld are like the first two I would think of right away.
Mm-hmm.
So my traditional thought of a Euro would be the types of games that they design. And I've listed at least 4 things that I think of. One is a very low degree of randomness in the game itself. This is highly in contrast to games like Monopoly, where you literally just roll dice, and that's a huge part of the game. Resource management, generally some sort of different types of resources, collecting resources, options on how to spend them for short-term, long-term rewards, that type of thinking. Another one that I think is core to a Euro would be a high degree of indirect conflict as opposed to more direct styles. So I would say that most war games are not going to be Euros. You're explicitly attacking someone else. Even games that involve any type of mechanic where steal a card from someone's hand or something like that, steal a resource for someone, is kind of anti-Euro, if you ask me. I think there's a bit of a some people claim that Euros, and I kind of agree, are a bit like these multiplayer solitaire games because they're so anti-conflict. And then the last one that I think of when using Euros is they usually use victory points as a measure of winning the game. And victory points are totally outside like what the game actually is. Like it's not a resource, it's not number of spaces on a map. It's just different actions give you points. Add up the points and you win. And that's my definition of what a Euro is.
Okay, that's fair. So I feel like I would say our definitions themselves aren't actually that different from each other.
Yep.
So I guess my definition in more of a sentence form is I feel like a Euro is a game where the focus is progressing your engine or tableau or your general game state, primarily through efficiency and optimized play. So in my definition, I guess our kind of conflict is the amount of interaction in the game, in a Euro game, I guess. So I feel like in my definition, there still is room for interaction, even conflict, even like direct conflict where you're attacking another player. But
yeah,
generally, in my eyes, a Euro, that's kind of like the side piece. So that can get you, or the only reason you generally would attack someone is so that you can be more efficient and more optimized in your play. Whereas I feel like in other Ameritrash games, attacking is the primary focus, and the objective is to attack other players and control land or what have you.
That's it. Okay. I like this definition. It's a little more soft than when we spoke earlier. I still think it's a little too broad, maybe. And that's right. I'm not necessarily saying, oh, that's right or wrong, but I think categorizations are more helpful when they're like tight, right? Mm-hmm. So a game like Twilight Imperium, let's just throw it out there.
Right.
I think you are suggesting it's likely a Euro.
No, I wouldn't say that's a Euro.
Okay.
I think it has Euro elements
sure.
To it. So a lot of like the resource management kind of things. But there is still a heavy focus on the conflict there, I think.
Okay.
And
yeah,
I can't really remember. Does conflict give you? It doesn't inherently give you points, does it?
Not inherently. Maybe there's like objectives or kind of offshoot things. But my definition is really just because you conquer land, and land gives you planets, and that builds up your engine.
Right. Fair.
So it fits under what you're suggesting. Let's say that's why I threw it out there.
Yeah, no, that is definitely something that fits. But I do think with TI, there is still more of a heavy focus on that conflict where that is, I mean, like you said, it is kind of an objective sometimes to just fight other people for the sake of doing it, right? So I think that kind of lends more towards the Ameritrash side of things, and also just like the
Oh, yeah.
what's up?
The just the juxtaposition of TI4 and Ameritrash is already like, oh, I to me those are so far apart for each other that
Right. I mean, yeah, I
we
feel
can
like
we can dig
TI4
into
is
this later.
kind of like a, I don't know, might be more of a mix than other Ameritrash kind of like
Uh-huh.
risk type games or
Oh,
more
please
traditional
say
kind of.
you please say yes to that. Come on.
Oh, I don't know. What do you consider TI4 then?
Well, so I think there's an assumption here you're making, which is that there's like a spectrum,
Right. Yeah.
and games are either Euros or they're Ameritrash, and you're like you can be a 70% Euro, 30% Ameritrash,
Right.
and I really just like this type of categorization because I think there's just so many different dimensions
Yeah.
you can pull games in, right? I think it's important to get into this because it might seem like we're just debating this for the sake of definition,
Mhm.
but this matters a lot, at least to me. For example, if I'm trying to watch a movie, I don't think you can just say a movie is happy, sad. Like it's too broad of a stroke, right?
Right.
There's so many other ways, like in movies, right? If someone tells you this movie's a romantic comedy, this movie's like a slapstick comedy, like even that, you
Mhm.
kind of know what you're going to get into. And that's like a nice fine grain
Right.
point of definition. And I think board games would greatly benefit from that level of nuance.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't think it has to be, Euro or Ameritrash.
Okay.
I'm willing
Yeah.
to
No, that's
to
fair.
really open up that two-dimensional, one-dimensional line.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess I shouldn't, just throw it into one or the other or somewhere in between. It definitely, board games are definitely very, complex in that there's, I mean, every board game is pretty much a system of mechanics that
Yes.
kind of build it up and have a lot of interplay. So it's hard to just kind of reduce it down to
Yeah.
one or two words, I
I
think.
totally agree with you, and I think this is also interesting because it happens so often, even
Mhm.
outside of this Euro Ameritrash spectrum. BGG, Board Game Geek, is already a good example because their categorizations are strategic, thematic, party. I don't even know what else there is, but
I think there's a family
oh my
and
gosh,
maybe something
family,
else. I don't know.
extremely broad categories
Right.
that fail to capture. And even then, so here's one thing we've discussed a little in the past that I particularly dislike as well. When someone says a game is heavy
Okay.
or a game is light, this like one word, super broad category. And yeah, I really don't think this makes sense in a lot of ways.
Right. Well, yeah, it is hard because you don't know what their kind of point of reference is or what they would consider light or what they consider heavy, right?
That's that's one reason for sure. But even within the space of heavy games, I don't think it's that easy to define.
Mhm.
I think sure, let's say heaviness just means how complex the game is. You know, I think you could get into a very theoretical, mathematical number of decisions and options type of thing.
Right.
But I would at least argue that complexity is hard to define when practically looking at the game experience. And players have a very different reaction to different types of complexity. I think when it comes to things like game theoretic, what is this person's incentives? That can be very complex. And then there's the whole, this will give me 1 point now or 5 points in 10 turns. How do I like optimize that graph? That's like a whole other type of complexity to me.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, some people might be better at that form of complexity.
Yep, exactly.
And while others might be better at the social aspect of things. So it is hard to, say one is more complex than the other, or if someone is better at the math side of things, then they might find, a heavy social game to be what they would consider very heavy and complex. Whereas, something like Power Grid, which is very math heavy, they might consider that a walk in the park.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's like, exactly. And I think we've started to discuss this, and we did discuss this obviously before today a little bit, because there are different knobs of not even just complexity, but like mechanics and how the game works.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is really important because people have preferences and tastes. And if someone says, oh, I like these types of things, what board game? No one's going to say, I like heavy games. Maybe. There actually probably are people that say that.
Yeah, people say that all the time, I think.
And what does this even mean? If someone came to me and said, I like strategic games, I would have no idea what to do with them,
Right.
Give me a recommendation. I like strategic games. Like,
right. Well, what if someone said, I like Euros, or I like Ameritrash games? Do you think you'd have a better,
I would have only a slightly better idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, I think it's still, when I'm thinking about it now, I feel like if someone was to come up to me and say, like, I like heavy games, it would be hard to say, like, okay, let's sit down and play on TI4 or whatever, right? But I feel like it does kind of give me a point of reference into...
For sure. It's not a useless statement. Maybe I said it was useless before, but it could be much more helpful.
Right.
And I think this is like somewhat interesting, right? You and I, we both play and teach board games to new people very frequently, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And, I would like to consider myself empathetic enough to be the type of person who considers, like, I'm going to try and teach a game that I'm pretty sure this audience will enjoy. And I often find that this is really difficult. Like, I don't even know what to ask sometimes, and that's the problem. There are a few things that feel worse to me than like someone saying, oh, I like board games, and you pull out a dud and they really you can tell it's just not working.
Right.
And yeah, their impression of board games is changed because of this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to avoid those types of experiences.
Right. So you're generally just looking for a better way to categorize things, I guess, or categorize board games.
Yes.
So that you can have a better jumping off point to suggest or figure out what games to pull out with someone.
Yes, exactly. And I think I've at least thought about this, and you have too, about the different dimensions that exist in board games. I'm not trying to, perfectly classify every game out there, but I think you and I are at the point where we're starting to at least suggest more valuable things to mention or consider when trying to assess how likely it is someone will enjoy a game. So how about we just start going over some of these?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I like to think I would be good at suggesting games, but I don't know.
Yeah. So I think one thing that's already very embedded in the things that we're saying right now would be the level of interaction amongst players.
Right.
I think this is often, at least for me, conflated with the Euro Ameritrash argument, where, the less conflict the less likely it is someone will like screw me over, attack me, the better.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't like that, right? There's lots of different degrees of interaction. So I guess just kind of putting these points, there's the Euro version, which is extremely indirect. Some Euros are extreme solitaires, and I would say the only real form of interaction in Euros would be contention over shared resources or actions, maybe.
Okay.
And to me, this is a very traditional Euro thing. I would think of games like Agricola, Terra Mystica, which are games I very much enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
But they all would fit into this space to me.
Okay. No, that's fair. I mean, I think that also kind of fits my definition of Euros. But I do think that there's a little more room for direct attacks. But anyways.
Yeah, and then moving to slightly more, I would say are points where maybe your attack we're using as a very broad term here.
Right.
So I wouldn't say an attack is like units killing other units on the board on a map. I would just say it's any attack that very directly like raises your utility and lowers someone else's utility.
Right. Yeah, you're like negatively impacting someone else's.
Exactly, like very directly.
Yes.
Of course, any war game fits into this. But even then, I don't think that's the most interactive a game can get. So in some games, you have to really like telegraph these moves or plan them out a little more in advance. Even a game like Diplomacy, which I think most people would consider a very, very, very interactive game. Mm-hmm. Some moves require planning, and you can't just decide right away, I'm going to screw this person over. Like you really got to do it and signal your intentions a little earlier. And to me, that's still direct, but it's a little less interactive to me. And then the pure form of interaction is, I would say, it's like how connected you are to other players. Can you really influence any player on any given turn? And Cosmic Encounter, I would say, is a very classic example here.
Right.
You're attacking someone, you can invite anyone on the table to help you do card interactions with them. Very little stops you from screwing someone over if you really want to.
Yeah, no, fair. So in terms of, I guess, in thinking of when you're recommending games and, broadly categorizing games and having these types of interactions, is there one that you would be more inclined to introduce to, let's say, newer players? Because I feel like in my experience, I'm very hesitant to introduce games that are very purely like indirect interaction. Because I always feel like
indirect.
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree.
I guess maybe because traditional games like Monopoly or Sorry or what have you are kind of that quick, direct form of interaction, and just jumping onto the other end might be a little too much of a shift, in my opinion. Yeah. But I'm always kind of scared that, and I guess there is more of a risk in those kind of indirect interaction games that someone does just kind of get lost in their own system or is very disengaged, and there's no real way to like bring them back in. I think
that's super true, and this is touching on so many like other things when it comes to board games that, let's say, we'll get into maybe in the future sometime. But I would chalk it mostly up to personality, I think. One thing I've seen in my experience is sometimes it is a little easier to play these indirect games with strangers.
Right. Yes.
Like if I'm playing a game that's very interactive, you got to attack people with total strangers, and I don't have any reason to do anything to any of these people. It's a bit weird, right? I think it'd be a bit weird, and it's a kind of a nice thing about these indirect games that, they're just a little lower conflict. You're less likely to hurt someone's feelings, let's say.
There's pathetic, I think.
And I think that part of that comes down to people's personalities as well. Mm-hmm. I definitely think implicitly I try and assess someone's maybe it's tied to like how extroverted they seem or how
Mhm.
how like I don't want to use the word obnoxious, but like that level,
Boisterous.
yeah, how boisterous they are, and that does give me an idea of the degree to which they would enjoy interaction. And I
Right.
think this is a very core, very useful way to think about games.
Okay, that's fair. In all honesty, I don't think I explicitly kind of think about this. I mean, I think I do. Um, like I said, I do worry that some games might just be very unengaging for some people. But I don't think I've ever categorized games in my head like this. So it's a good
You
thing to
see,
think of it
we're
that.
already doing great things
Yeah, thank you,
for
Connor.
ourselves. We're improving our local groups as well.
Yeah, it's really all about us, I think.
Of course, we don't actually need listeners.
Yeah, exactly. You guys. Yeah, I
Um,
think I typically more geared towards categorizing things by probably more so mechanics.
yep, I think
So
that's
like,
a good way to do it as well.
yeah, so like worker placement games or area control games or even like cooperative games or drafting games, things like that. So I think in my mind, there is a closer correlation between like if someone likes, for example, Seven Wonders as a drafting game, then in my mind, it feels more likely that they'll also like another drafting game like Sushi Go, for example. Well, those are
Sure,
very similar games, but
they are, yes,
you
but
kind of understand what I'm saying. Or like a lot of the worker placement games, if someone likes Agricola, someone else might like. Can't think of another one off the top of my head. That's not like Caverna.
you could say Puerto Rico, even though that's not really.
I've had this discussion with other people, and I definitely don't consider Puerto Rico a worker
It's
placement
not
game.
work. I agree, it's not worker placement, but it feels similar. You're taking things that other people want. We don't have to.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a can of worms here, but
It's an side.
yeah.
But yeah, so I feel like I generally try or naturally do categorize things by mechanics, although probably if I'm talking to someone who is less experienced with board games, that's not the most useful thing to use, I would say.
Yes, I can definitely say from experience in the last year or so during COVID, I've been able to be fortunate enough to play with a regular group pretty often, and it's almost like a bit of an experiment, right? You can tell what mechanics people are starting to really appreciate, and you can even ask, "What did you like about this game?"
Mm-hmm.
And that starts to inform even more and more the types of games that they would like, and it's not a well-defined process. I'm definitely still navigating it, but yeah, you can have those mechanic styles discussions, maybe not in the very first play as you just suggested, but
Mm-hmm. Right.
fourth, fifth, like you've tried a variety of games, you can start to see that. And yes,
Yeah.
I certainly
I
agree.
think one of the issues is that most games don't explicitly say like, oh yeah, we're a deck building game or worker placement game or what have you, right? So if you if you introduce someone to Agricola and they're like, oh yeah, I really like the mechanism, like where I place my family members out or
Yeah,
what
sure.
have you,
Yeah, sure.
it's hard. I mean, I don't think they would naturally say, oh yeah, that's worker placement, right? So it's hard to kind of
Yeah, you
define
gotta.
that, or you have to define it for them, I
I
suppose.
agree for sure. Um, I do think it's maybe this is a pause point.
Hello.
I do think it's you mentioned something just now about games don't like to explicitly say that they are worker placement games, drafting games. Do you think that's like because these terms are still pretty broad and not that well defined? Do you think that I don't want to say designers are scared to do it or like the
Mhm.
community is scared to do it, but do you think that comes into play at all?
I think it does. I think it might feel a little too on the nose, I guess, to just incorporate that. I mean, there are some games that incorporate it into their title. I think like deck building games, for whatever reason,
Yep.
are a little more inclined to say like we're a deck building game. But I guess a lot of games want to stay or have the veil of being thematic, right? So it's hard to be thematic while also saying like, oh, by the way, we're a worker placement game.
Yeah, it's great that you bring that up because I would say I'm a very mechanics driven person who likes theme but wouldn't value it that strongly. Would you say the same about yourself? Let's just start there.
Yeah, I definitely would. Theme is not. I don't browse the thematic games category. Let's say that.
But I do think there's nothing wrong with people that do, right?
No, no.
Like I have some friends I can think of who are very inclined towards space games. They just love that theme. And even almost to the point where the mechanics don't even matter as much. Right? You can have very different types of games, but if it's space themed, they're going to enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
And despite the fact that this isn't something we probably think about or do, I do think it's a useful, helpful way to continue like that game exploration step, right? Like,
yeah, that's fair. I mean, yeah, I think because we're probably so unpicky with games, it's hard
yeah,
to kind of step in those shoes. But to me, I feel like games can be so varied that just because a game is set in space, they can feel so much different and give you a lot of different feelings throughout the way or throughout the play too. So I'd be very hesitant to if someone told me they like if they like space games, I'd be hard pressed to just use that as the main kind of way for me to suggest games to them. I think.
I agree. I mean, at that point, the theme becomes the main driver, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it's evident that's really what they enjoy, maybe it's like some role playing imagination part. It's always an experience, right? It's not
right.
It's not always purely about the mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure you and I, if someone said I'm looking for space games, I played Galaxy Trucker, I want more space games. You could think of many. I could, and I'm sure you could too.
Yeah, but yeah, that's the thing. Even if they told me like, yeah, I play Galaxy Trucker, I want more space games, I feel like I would still default to like thinking about what other games are like
Are
Galaxy
similar enough.
Yeah, like mechanic wise, rather than giving them some other random space
TI4.
Yeah, TI4. Just from
It's
like
time.
a 10-minute game.
Do you have 10 hours to spare?
Yeah.
That's fair.
No.
Of course. Everything, yeah, within reason.
I think it's also because a lot of games I play are a little more Euro sided, and those games also tend to not be very heavily focused on the theme. So I feel like a lot of the mechanics in those games don't really get the theme across very well.
That's very, very true as well. I guess you, just to confirm, you suggest that this is a symptom of Euros, that it's often theme disconnected from mechanics.
Yes. I mean, I think the theme is basically just so they can have some kind of nice artwork or something.
Yeah. I mean,
people.
For sure. That's very true. And of course, this is another axis in which a game can thrive, in my opinion. Sometimes themes can just feel so natural to a game. And sometimes it's you like basically it has a theme, but you just don't care at all because it's so disconnected from the game itself. And I think, yeah, anyone who's theme driven, maybe that's thematic games, how tightly coupled everything is, the theme and the mechanics and the experience itself.
Right. Yeah. So it would be, I would be curious to see if like I threw a space game that didn't feel like a space game at them, in your example, and see if your friend would still like it.
Yeah.
Might be a good test.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe at this point, I feel like we could just close off by going a little bit beyond game recommendation into game purchasing, which is something.
Ooh.
I mean,
you can look
you've got a very impressive shelf there. I do not.
Where's your shelf?
My shelf is tucked away and hidden.
Are you ashamed?
I'm not posting a comment on my collection on Reddit anytime soon. Let me tell you that.
Well, I mean, I think you're just afraid to get roasted.
I would get roasted, no doubt.
You don't have any. I don't feel like you don't have any games you should be ashamed of. You're fine. But yeah, board game purchasing is definitely a very, I don't know, it's a personal thing, obviously.
For sure.
Obviously, it also is tied to just the amount of money you have.
Yeah.
The amount of games you can be purchasing within your entertainment budget. But for me, in terms of how I kind of discover new games and games I want to purchase, I feel like it is a lot to do with reviews from other podcasters or board game channels or what have you, like the Dice Tower, obviously.
Yeah.
There's Shut Up, Sit Down, Rahdo, what have you.
Yeah. The big hitters. Yeah.
Yeah. So generally, I watch a lot of those, and I don't know if I even watch like the full reviews. I kind of just look for games that are mentioned multiple times between them, I think.
I don't watch as many reviews as you do, but I'm always worried about if something is just a function of hype.
Yes.
Right? It's getting reviewed, it's hype. You buy it or you try it. I don't even buy it. I just try it. And I'm like, what the heck is this hype for? I'm about to throw out a hot take. Wingspan.
Ooh.
Game is nothing special to me.
Ooh.
And it's so hyped. Right? Like that's a classic example in my books.
But the pastel eggs.
Oh my gosh.
And the little dice tower with the bird, the feeder.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, yeah, there's definitely games that are just overly hyped. And definitely even some companies like Wingspan is from Stonemaier Games. And that company, I think, does naturally have a lot of hype surrounding it.
Yeah.
So that definitely plays a role in it, I think. And it is hard to differentiate, whether or not this game is just overly hyped because of external factors or if it is a good game. But yeah. I think if you hear it from enough sources, I want to say I would hope that it'd be good. And I also look on like Reddit and other places as well for more like
for sure
opinions.
So let me ask you this, especially as someone who purchases a fair deal more than I do.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say your success rate is on buying a game and then learning, like, I really do like this game a lot versus I shouldn't have bought this, basically?
That's you're assuming I play all the games I buy. It's a bold assumption.
And you're trying to draw some more hot takes out from me.
I just collect board games, I don't actually play them.
That's fine.
I don't know. I don't know what my rate would be. I think it's also hard because I feel like I want to convince myself that, oh yeah, this is a great game. I love this game.
Sure.
Or maybe I don't actually. I think that is a fairly common phenomenon, especially with Kickstarter,
because people invest. Broader in the community.
Yeah. People invest a lot of money and wait years for games to come. So by the time they get here, they kind of want it to be good. So they are very biased when they're giving reviews, which is definitely fair. I want to say at least like 2/3 of the games I get,
sure,
I'm like, okay, this is pretty good. But I do also do my research. Like I do try and get a general sense of the rules of the game and a sense of whether or not I would like it. Like some storytelling games or games that are more thematically driven, I feel like I just do not gravitate towards those games.
Yeah.
I tend not to buy those types of games.
Yeah, right? I wonder how many people, this thought just kills me, decide they want to get into board games, open Board Game Geek,
Ooh.
Click on whatever's like first or like in the top 5, at the time, and just blindly buy it.
Oh, that's hilarious. If someone just orders Gloomhaven because it's like off Amazon or something, and then they get this like freaking 2-foot long box to their door, I feel like that'd be terrified. I I feel
Yeah.
like that doesn't happen too much. I want to say. I would hope. I feel like
Yeah.
Board Game Geek is actually not that wide reaching.
Yeah. I mean, we don't totally know what percentage of people
Like you should,
do research versus deep research. Like, I
yeah,
don't know.
yeah. You
Yeah.
should ask your friends. Ask your friends that are, kind of just starting into board games if they've discovered Board Game Geek.
They definitely have, but
Have they? Okay.
yes. But I
Okay.
will say, because some of them have started to talk to me about buying their own games, it still comes from a very recommendation
Right.
oriented.
Are they asking you mostly?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, I try my best to say, given that I've played this with you and you like it, you might like this. Or I will
Right.
probe with some extra questions of what they might like or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is behavior that the community should endorse and focus on more.
Want more research before buying games? Or better recommendations?
I think it's both. And to me, the key thing that's missing here is a better framework with which people can think about games. We have very broad strokes right now, such as it's a strategy game, it's a heavyweight game. These are not useful yet or ever will be.
Yeah, I don't think they will be.
And there's some that are getting a bit better, right? A deck builder, a dudes on a map game, that type of language is getting there. But I think the board game hobby is still pretty young.
Mm-hmm.
And this will start to evolve more and more, right? There are analogous hobbies such as music and movies that have evolved to this point way more. And maybe we don't actually do anything. Board games will just naturally, like, hopefully board games are still alive in 50 years.
They will.
We're not all just playing VR games.
I mean, we'll play VR board games. It's fine.
We'll talk about this later, but this is not the same thing. So maybe the hobby will just gravitate towards that. But I do think the community really needs to get better at thinking about games in a more intentional way.
Okay.
Do you have any parting thoughts when it comes to game categorization?
I would mostly say just like stop hating on Euros. That's one. They're a great thing. Everyone could use more Euros in their life. And Euros can be interactive, okay? But I do agree with you that being more intentional about categorizing things and hopefully having a better system to do it than what exists on Board Game Geek would be nice. I mean, they're trying their best. Board games are just naturally a hard thing to categorize.
They are.
And each board game probably has a lot of different mechanics, like I've said, that work together. So it is hard to just boil it down to one. But it would be nice if there was a better system, I guess, to be able to explore games that one could naturally progress to, whether it be someone just starting the hobby or someone who is a little more experienced in the hobby.
Yeah.
I don't know what that would kind of look like or how that would be implemented, but hopefully someone much smarter than me can figure that out. And
you're smart, Victor. My closing comment, and I guess is a bit of a marketing comment too, is I think mechanics, especially misunderstood mechanics and types of games, can cause unnecessary friction when playing board games. And I definitely have more thoughts on this that we will touch on in future discussions
next time.
But I think people that misinterpret the degree of interaction that they're expecting, misinterpret the complexity of the moves or the types of things, this leads to general bad feelings during board games. And I'd like to dive into each of those a little more.